Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome from a very cool but fine Melbourne to our ATSE Victorian Division New Fellows Seminar for June. My name is Michael Edwards, but let me begin by respectfully acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the unceded land that we are gathered upon for the event tonight. We recognise their continuing connection to land, water, sky and community, and we pay our respects to their ancestors, elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here today or online. Thank you. It's wonderful to see so many fellows and guests here in the room tonight, and I hope you really enjoyed the chance to network and chat amongst friends and colleagues in the lead up to the seminar. The Victorian Division have recognised that we're still sort of getting used to the idea of coming back out post-COVID. And so we're really pleased to be able to put on a networking event tonight that was part of a catalyst, if you like, to try and make that a more regular occurrence for us all going forward. And I hope you're enjoying each other's company in that respect. We want to thank everyone for warmly engaging in the New Fellows Seminar tonight as well. So let me briefly introduce Louise Adams here. We're privileged, and thank you, Louise, for joining us tonight. I'll do a short bio for Louise, and then she'll come up and give some remarks for about 20 or 30 minutes. We'll have some Q&A after that. So Louise Adams is Aurecon's Chief Operating Officer, responsible for driving the financial, operational, and people performance across all areas of their business to achieve the group's strategic business goals. Reporting to Aurecon's Group CEO, Louise is a member of the Group Executive Leadership Team. Amongst numerous awards and significant accolades, Louise was notably named the Australian CEO of the Year in November 2020, which is part of the CEO Magazine's Executive of the Year Awards. In October 2021, Louise was named as a Deakin University Alumni of the Year, and in November 21 was elected as a new fellow to ATSE. As a chartered civil engineer, Louise has over 20 years experience in managing and designing works in both civil and multidisciplinary projects in land development, as well as technical advisory for project planning, and has led major civil and multidisciplinary projects in just about every continent around the world, as I read, maybe with the exception of Antarctica, from the look of your bio. And Louise is planning, as I said, to speak for about 20 or 30 minutes Q&A. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Louise to discuss the changing face of engineering towards a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. And yes, I'm still working with the team to win some good work down in Antarctica and fulfill the complete continental sweep. But good evening, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. First, let me also start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting here today, the peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters, and I thank them for protecting this coastline and its ecosystems. I also pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people here with us present today and also online. There is no better time in our history than right now, faced with the current complex and varied societal challenges that we have, for us to ensure that our First Nations people have a voice at the table, at every table, in fact. May we learn from their wisdom and take pride in being part of the longest continuous culture on this planet, as well as the many scientific and engineering feats that they have bestowed along the way. Second, welcome to any other new fellows that we have here today. I'm sure, like me, you're very much enjoying the experience so far, especially as we start to come back together in person, which is fabulous here in Melbourne. And I keep thinking what a privilege it is to be part of the group that is helping to outline the pathway for Australia to thrive into the future. That work is what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, not specific innovations and solutions, but how we can work together to ensure everything we do results in the best possible outcomes for our nation. And full disclosure, as Michael said, I am an engineer and I run a company that operates in construction and infrastructure. So it's with a slight apologetic tone, albeit not a regretful one, that this speech will include a strong bias slanting towards engineering. Apologies for that. Now, I'm not one for hyperbole, but I am going to make a bold statement to start us off here. Australia depends on us, our peers and our colleagues. As applied scientists, technologists and engineers, we hold a deep responsibility to help our nation, its governments, industries, businesses and communities to make choices that will lead to a sustainable, livable future. We all know the action we take as a planet over the next decade will determine the world's climate for the next century. Each of you in your own field, in your own way, are helping to make sure those actions are the smart ones, if not necessarily the easy ones. For me and the organisation I work for, I'm extremely aware that helping our clients move to net zero emissions and doing so ourselves as an organisation is one of the biggest and most important challenges we've ever faced, and the biggest opportunity we've ever had to make a difference, not just for our clients, but for society more broadly. In fact, we've challenged ourselves to look at everything we do through the lens of sustainability, whether we're helping our clients shape and build new infrastructure, maintain and optimize existing infrastructure, or transition all their infrastructure towards net zero. We have a role to play ensuring all of it is done with all eyes on creating a sustainable outcome. The health of our people, our communities and our planet depend on us getting this right and leaning into the conversation with all stakeholders. I think it would be very easy for us to just work with those who are committed, who are on the journey, who have already drunk the Kool-Aid. But I would argue it is just as important for us to use our skills and our knowledge to challenge the laggards, to advocate for change and to drive the right outcomes across the board. In Australia, as in every country around the world, decarbonising our economy to combat the negative impacts of climate change is a complex journey. We need to navigate away from how we operate today industrially to a net zero model. That means questioning almost every aspect of our energy, process, material, mobility, all decisions across every industry. It's a monstrous task anywhere, made harder here by the often short-term termism engendered by partisan politics, to the point where climate action has moved beyond politics. It is business leaders rather than political leaders who are setting the pace on climate change policy and emissions reduction in our country today. The Business Council of Australia has a more ambitious 2030 emissions reduction target than either of our current major political parties. Qantas is pushing for the development of an Australian sustainable aviation fuel industry, and we even have a tech billionaire using his influence, or trying to, and the dollars that go with it to accelerate the timeline for our biggest energy supplier to retire coal power stations and to force the development of a solar export industry. In a recent PwC survey of the nation's top 50 CEOs, one of the questions was, what should Australia's most pressing priorities be when it comes to the country's physical infrastructure? The resounding answer was decarbonisation and net zero, followed closely by the related issue of expanding renewable energy zones. In boardrooms around the country, business leaders are having the type of conversations that only used to happen in Canberra. The business-led charge towards decarbonisation is both good news and bad news. The good news is that business leaders want this change. They know that today an organisation's future economic success has direct links to its sustainability and climate change performance, and they want to make smart choices, and we can collectively help them. But we must recognise the solution is not just about inventing the new technologies, new approaches, new designs, new infrastructure, but also at the same time adapting the old. For me and my team, as we help our clients make the transition to decarbonised economy, we're discovering that yes, innovating business models, operating models, technology and supply chains is part of the equation, but we also have to think more broadly around how to extend the life of existing assets to retrieve as much value from those as possible from current investments. Much of the infrastructure we have today has embodied carbon and embodied financial value, so we shouldn't just throw it out. Just as we are approaching this with a sustainability mindset, we also must critically look at our solutions with a circular economy mindset. We can help them build their business using the principles of sustainability and circular economies. We can teach them to think holistically about sustainability, building into the way we design, but to also ensure longevity and resilience well into the future. We tell our clients, sustainability is not just about changing up the products you make or how you run your organisation, but about how you manage and protect your assets, be they old or new, into the future. And this is where engineers in particular have such an important role to play, because this is where companies need smart, practical, and innovative solutions. It's all very well for a consultant to write a report about the risks and opportunities of climate transition, but a report is only helpful if the outcomes of that report can actually be executed. Companies need physical help to execute the changes required to mitigate those risks and seize the opportunities that come from them. If you own a port facility with a wharf designed to permit a specific type of cargo ship carrying a specific weight, who's going to design and transform it for rising sea levels? An engineer will. If you're a global beverage supplier and you have vast swathes of refrigeration assets across the planet to store your product, who's going to redesign and retrofit those refrigeration assets for rising temperatures? An engineer is going to. Who's going to redesign our stormwater systems to cope with the increased frequency of what were once rare rainfall events? Who's going to design our cities to be more resilient for extreme weather? I could go on almost all night, I suspect, but I think you get the point. We need an army of engineers and technologists to help businesses make those myriad transition, but there's a problem, because according to almost everybody that you talk to, that army of engineers and technologists simply doesn't exist. Australia has a critical skills shortage in STEM and especially in engineering. Now, we know that COVID hasn't caused this critical skills shortage, but it is the perfect storm. The temporary cutting off of skilled migration, coupled with an unprecedented investment in infrastructure across a number of sectors, leading to an amplification of an issue that was probably long in hibernation. The demand for skills in this room is at an all-time high. STEM occupations are increasing twice as fast as non-STEM occupations, with projections showing they will continue to grow by 13% over the next 5 years. As well as being needed to support the carbon transition, demand for engineers is coming from nuclear submarines, the emerging hydrogen industry, more advanced manufacturing, and our growing local space industry. And that's on top of the flood of rebuild and infrastructure projects such as the Inland Rail Network, along with numerous other defence and regional projects. On current predictions, by 2023, Australia will be over 100,000 engineers short of the level needed to deliver the various industry outcomes reliant on this skill set across numerous pipelines of work. The seriousness of this shortage has recently been recognised, such that the National Skills Commission now includes 13 engineering occupations on its skills priority list. So why is this happening? In my opinion, it's really three main reasons. First, because the migration pipeline has been closed for a couple of years. And even prior to that, it was widely acknowledged that many migrants to Australia who came here with professional engineering skills ended up sitting on the bench, so to speak, unable to crack into the profession due to a series of numerous factors. Secondly, because we simply don't have enough graduates entering the profession. The reasons for this are complex and broad, whether it is that we simply don't have enough knowledge around the professions in our schools. Teachers and counsellors are just unsure of what engineering is, or it could be that it suffers from the uncool brand and we see a drop in participation in key subjects of maths and physics in later school years, or even the flow-on effects from the fact that there is a teaching workforce also struggling to fill roles in STEM areas like maths and science, which results in schools reporting significant STEM teacher shortages. 2 in 5 secondary teachers teach subjects outside their fields of expertise, with math, science and technology being primary areas where this occurs. An Australian Education Union report showed that more than 70% of the schools surveyed said that employed science and maths teachers who were not qualified in the subject. And if, like me, you genuinely find when you speak to engineers that this is a profession that one is inspired into, either by a relative or someone you meet or an amazing teacher, then it's no wonder the flow-on effect of all of the above is an absence of massive numbers of graduates. And third, and this factor continues to perplex me, the engineering profession is almost become a victim of its own success. It turns out engineers are perhaps too bloody useful. Business has worked out that engineers have fantastically transferable skills. An engineering education delivers people with a very strong cognitive ability, the capacity to solve problems, and an evidence-based scientific ethos. Engineers are both thinkers and doers, the most likely people in a company to roll up their sleeves, experiment, and actually build and fix things. And at a time when we know businesses need to rethink, innovate, adapt, exchange, and execute change, engineers have a mindset that is now prized in every business, and salaries are reflecting this. As long ago as 2016, the Australian National Census found around half of all employed engineering graduates were not working in engineering occupations. And I imagine that that figure has only increased today. And so how do we solve this? Well, in my opinion, there are a number of levers that must be pulled. For the medium and long term, we must increase take up of STEM subjects and build awareness of engineering, technology, and applied science careers early in a person's education. This requires a long-term commitment and planning by industry, government, schools, and the tertiary sector. And we must be mindful that there is a long lead time for educating and developing a STEM professional. We must also broaden out the conversation through our media. Yes, it might be easy to represent engineers through the lens of the construction industry. Plenty of politicians cutting ribbons, opening up the latest and greatest road / bridge / building / stadium. And that's all wonderful. And I do mean that because that's where I've spent much of my career. But what engineers do is so much more than hard hats and high vis. And I hope that we can also admit that that part of our profession has a little bit of work to do to become more inclusive and progressive to attract more talent. So whilst we're working on that, why not showcase the many other industries that thrive off the back of engineers? I think if our kids knew the endless opportunities that these skills could provide them, then we could slowly turn this perception around. Professional skills, universally recognised, job security, decent income, and I think even more importantly for them now, impact, purpose, solving the world's most complex problems. And let's not forget space, maybe I should say solving humanity's most complex problems. But that's admittedly going to take time. So in the short and medium time, we therefore need to draw on skilled migration once again. And if we consider how to get more people in, then the government's inclusion of certain engineering occupations on the priority migration skilled occupation list will assist in the short term. However, broader thinking is needed to ensure supply. And from my experience at the moment, unfortunately, trying to attract international talent over the past 6 to 12 months back into Australia, we are going to need to convince these people that we are genuinely back open and ready for business. Without arguing the pros and cons of how we got here, we must admit that Brand Australia has a little bit of work to do. And if we are to rebuild migration, then this is something we need to address. But once we get migration back up and going, then we need to also learn from the past and find ways to ensure that we have no one sitting on the bench. Whether this is finding a way for more accessible bridging courses to ensure that our standards are being met, or working to break down barriers to migrant participation within the Australian workforce. It makes no sense whatsoever in such challenging time with such skills shortages to have spare capacity sitting off to one side. And maybe we could do a little bit to attract back those many, many talented engineers who have taken their skills into the non-engineering related professions. And I say maybe for two reasons. Firstly, because I'm unsure we'll be able to match their salaries. And secondly, secretly, I don't think it hurts to have a few humble engineers scattered around the traps, say somewhere like banking. But even if we immediately act immediately and prioritise all of these solutions, it's not going to be enough. We're still going to be tens of thousands of engineers short for many years to come, which means that we really need to look at the problem through another lens. We need to use the people we have and the skill sets that they have much more efficiently. This is a supply and demand issue. The solution is not just increasing the supply, it needs to be finding ways to reduce the demand. And it's looking at achieving the same outcome another way, doing things dramatically differently to uplift productivity. So we don't need as many engineers, technologists, or applied scientists. So what might that look like? Well, again, I'm going to focus in on the infrastructure industry as that's the one I know best. And if we think of the layers involved with rolling out infrastructure projects, there is a lot of complexity in the supply chain. chain: financiers, project managers, client advisors, design managers, designers, checkers, verifiers, and believe me, they are different, and construction managers and constructors. Everyone's trying to employ the same skill set. And yet how much of this is valuable versus duplication and managing others to do the same tasks? There's plenty of opportunities for automation that exist. How do you take a process, remove the bureaucracy, and simply move on to get things done? If you've got a skilled engineer and they have to spend 2 days of their week wading through paperwork, bureaucracy, or red tape, then that's lost productivity in the grand scheme of things. What are the opportunities we have through automation and digital to minimize repetitive tasks and bureaucracy? We need to keep skilled people doing skilled work. We also need to go back to the drawing board and rethink how we approach building and construction in particular. We know this industry in Australia is a laggard when it comes to productivity. It's not improved its productivity in decades, and research estimates it often wastes over 30% of its efforts, and I would argue possibly even more. I believe one of our fundamental flaws in this industry is that we seem to be compelled to start everything from a blank piece of paper, which seems crazy when so much of the built environment literally has the same base components. Surely there's an opportunity here to learn from how engineers in, say, the manufacturing sector approach their work and bring this to construction. Rather than doing the bulk of the work in situ from scratch, we should be looking at manufacturing as many of the pieces and components as possible, finding scalable solutions to problems in our built environment. And in fact, it was this thinking that helped one of our groups of engineers crack a major issue plaguing Australia's rural communities recently. And I just wanted to share this one example with you, not because it's a brilliant piece of innovation. In fact, some people might say it's so basic that you'd wonder why we haven't always been doing it, but because it's a great example of how we need to think differently when we solve problems. So the situation across Australia, local governments own more than 10,000 timber road bridges, many of which need to be replaced. And in some communities, these bridges are the only access to homes and communities. And in fact, during times of flood or fire, they can be the only way to get out of a community as well. With most constructed more than 100 years ago, all these rural bridges are deteriorating, and a substantial number are now rapidly approaching end of life. And there was one council client that our team spoke to they said that they were kept awake at night because the heaviest vehicle going across this bridge that was approaching end of life was the school bus. Now, in August 2020, the New South Wales government committed $500 million in funding to fix 1,800 of their timber bridges that were most in need of repair. And that also included the one that was keeping the sleep-deprived council up earlier, that I mentioned earlier. But there was a problem. The council was looking at two options. First one was cast a concrete deck in situ, which meant closing the road off for 3 months. Not a viable option when it's the only road in and out. Or the other option was to use a cheaper design that would quickly require expensive maintenance. Again, not an option in an industry which is moving towards low and zero maintenance bridges, not just because of the cost associated with it, but because of the safety risk involved in people inspecting and repairing these bridges. So that was the design problem that the council put on our desk when we went and talked to them, come up with a single system that would meet industry standards for all road types, while offering council a sustainable option with a short construction time, low cost and very low maintenance. What we came up with was, we called the A Bridge, a concrete structure with no bearing or deck joints, which means essentially no maintenance. Importantly, it's precast beforehand, so it was built in a quality controlled environment, so you don't get those quality control issues that you can get on site. In August last year, our client used an A Bridge to replace its timber bridge, and instead of 12 weeks on-site works to replace the bridge using traditional methods, the Kyogle A Bridge concrete components were all installed and the stitched concrete placed in only 3 days. The whole bridge was ready for traffic in just 2 weeks. And you can say, well, that's just a bridge, but the point is it's a repeatable bridge and it's a replicable process. And this A Bridge is highly resilient. There's no elements that can be dislodged even under the most severe flooding and debris buildup or log impact. And the design offers low embodied energy and a reduction in the quantity of concrete required, minimising the carbon footprint. Kyogle's first A Bridge has given the community great confidence, reliability and security in their road access. But if Australia needs to fix, or if New South Wales needs to fix 1,800 of these timber bridges, in our current industry approach, that might mean 1,800 design teams designing 1,800 individual bridges and then going and overseeing the construction of 1,800 bridges over 3 months apiece. Or we can now just scale the single solution to put in 1,800 bridges with most of the engineering done already in a fraction of the time. Now, times that by every other common infrastructure across Australia, and the level crossings removal program here is a classic example. 85 level crossings are going to be eliminated by 2025. And in that case, the Victorian government has sought to incentivise the participants in the level crossing removal program to share their lessons learned, share their innovation in a hope that they can also, over time, increase the efficiency of delivery because they recognise this problem. So what if every time an engineer in Australia solved a common problem, we tried to scale it? What if we mobilised the entire industry to look for more cost-effective, repeatable, and most importantly, sustainable ways to deliver solutions? What if we cross-shared knowledge and innovation, and as a default position, we took a manufacturing-based approach to construction? I know people here think modular construction and imagine a cookie-cutter solar suburb where everything looks the same. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about. You can still design something that looks quite unique and quite attractive, but the base components of it can be consistent. And what I'm saying is we need to look at other success stories of physical scalability and learn from them and be willing to adapt. If we put a similar lens over construction, water, energy, and all other peripheral industries, we can take a leaf out of the Lean Manufacturing Process Handbook. We need to take every process and look at every single opportunity just to make it more efficient. In my view, we're left with absolutely no choice. We must make these sectors more productive because we don't have enough people to push them forward. And if we aren't moving forward, then we aren't going to be shifting the dial on decarbonising these industries and pushing for net zero outcomes. And my fear is when businesses are capacity constrained, then innovation suffers. And the mindset tends to be that the tried and true is the safest and quickest option. So I said at the beginning, the business-led charge towards decarbonation was both good news and bad news. So the good news, as I've said, we have a country full of motivated business leaders, keen to make their organisations as sustainable as possible, and a profession equally motivated to help them. And although we don't have enough engineers to build sustainable infrastructure the traditional way, if we can boost productivity using automation, digital technology, and scalable processes to change the way we approach the work we do, the skills gap may not be as catastrophic as it currently looks. Achieving net zero won't be easy, but we're working in an era of technological advancement that sets to develop solutions that we are even yet to discover. But here's the bad news. Whenever I hear that individual businesses or individual business leaders are driving our national climate transition agenda, I do tend to get a sinking feeling, because whilst I know that we're all well-intentioned, making the best decisions we can see to support climate transition in our individual businesses and sometimes in individual industries, but there's still no one truly paying attention to the bigger picture. And people ask me what keeps me up at night. Honestly, I worry that every single entity in Australia is looking at sustainability through the lens of their own business models. Then there's a lot of good thinking and a lot of good work going on across the country to support our transition to a net zero economy, but ultimately it's bound to be quite siloed. And that's a huge problem because this is a topic that is completely horizontal. We need to think about the impact of climate change across the board, across the entire ecosystem, about how decisions in one industry will affect others, about the broader impacts of what we're doing to address climate change. I think we're very much aware of this idea when it comes to jobs. We know that economic transition needs to be managed well, and action needs to be taken to ensure that jobs in the low carbon economy have working conditions at least as good as those in the high carbon sectors, but we need to upskill coal workers as an example to work in renewables or green hydrogen, and that this requires some sort of centralised plan. We understand that the benefits of the low carbon economy also need to flow beyond the workforce to the wider community. Poorly done, our climate transition could not only result in stranded assets, but also in stranded workers and stranded communities. This is why we have internationally agreed guidelines for what is determined as a just transition. But we also need to look at this same idea in the context of our built environment. What happens when infrastructure change is made in isolation? So I'll take one small example. Right now, many countries are fixated on the transition to electric vehicles. But if we look beyond that, driverless cars are frequently touted as being part of the decarbonisation solution. And the evidence is pretty clear on how they'll benefit the planet. Not only will they help curb emissions, they have the potential to reduce fatalities of humans and wildlife and allow city planners to focus on green space and no roads. So you could think, well, that's all good. But now the rise of autonomous vehicles reduces the need for people to own their own car. And here's the thing, when every trip to work or play starts with an autonomous vehicle pulling up outside your door, does anyone any longer need a garage? So what am I going to convert my garage into? If I extend my living space, I now need to heat and cool that space. So if the average 4-bedroom house becomes a 5-bedroom house, we've instantly added load on the utilities grid. Or maybe I can now split the block because the average 3-bedroom house is now smaller, and over time, the density of our suburbs continues to grow. And I'm not suggesting that any of this is necessarily bad, but what I am suggesting is that our built environment is just like any other system. A change for good in one area can have a domino effect across the entire system, and not all the effects will be intended consequences. So who's going to manage the bigger picture? Regulation tends to be too slow and too blunt a tool to keep pace with the speed of change required to keep the planet livable. And the risk is that government and business alike remains too fragmented and too focused on short-term drivers. So who? So let me end where I began, but maybe it's a little less hyperbole this time around. Australia depends on us. As applied scientists, technologists, and engineers, we hold a deep responsibility to help our nation, its governments, industries, businesses, and communities to make choices that will lead to a sustainable, livable future. I would argue that it should be people of the calibre in this room who need to think about how we make the transition to net zero as a collective, how we face into the challenge of the skills shortages, how we engage in debate around productivity, and how we drive industries that rely on our skills to become more innovative, more efficient, and more sustainable. So as I finish up and we move into Q&A, I guess I'm just banging the ATSI drum a little. Never before has our collective advocacy and our work on policy been so critical. Regardless of your political persuasion, when it comes to leadership on climate change, after last weekend, there is no arguing that a small light has appeared at the end of the tunnel. Surely, at long last, we now have a space for a meaningful debate over how we as a nation can navigate this journey. And my challenge for all of us is, how do we ensure we play a very big part in it? Thank you.
Wonderful comment, and thank you so much for that. We're going to go into a Q&A now, and just for a reminder for those on the Zoom, you are welcome to put a question into the chat, and Ian will help us facilitate that here. But there'll be questions in the room, I'm sure, after that, Louise. Thank you very much. But I'm going to ask the first question, if you don't mind coming back into the camera spot there, if that's all right for the Zoom folks. Yeah, have a glass of water too. So you talked about you know, that inspiration to become engineers through the, you know, it being a long-term investment.
Mm.
Who or what was your inspiration to become an engineer?
Well, my inspiration was my granddad. He's no longer with us, but and it's an interesting story. He and I shared a love for bridges, and he was an amateur photographer. He was a drafter, and he used to travel around the world with my grandma. And he used to come back. They used to come back from their trips, and you know, back in the day, the whole family would gather in the lounge room. They'd take the tapestry off the wall, set up the slide projector, and put up the family photos, and we'd all be sitting there. And then at the end, slowly these family photos would turn into photo after photo after photo of bridges, and it would just end up being me and my granddad. And everybody else would just get bored and leave. But my granddad told me the story once that when I was about 5, he had been somewhere in Southeast Asia, I don't know where, and he'd taken this photo of this bridge, and underneath the at the abutment of the bridge there was these little shanty houses, and these people lived under this bridge. And I said to him, oh, that would be the most amazing thing. Imagine living under the bridge. How exciting would that be? And he said, well, it's not so great because every year the bridge floods and their houses get wiped away and they're very poor and they need to rebuild their houses. And he said, I turned to him and said, what would I need to be to fix that for them? And he said, you'd need to be a civil engineer. And I cannot, I don't remember that conversation, but I can't remember a day where I didn't, or I wasn't very focused on becoming a civil engineer.
Wonderful. Thank you. Questions, please. So,
Thank you. That was a very inspiring speech. So thank you very much. I think it was a great challenge to all of us. You talked about education, the role of education, and getting people into engineering.
Yeah.
And I can't agree more. A drum I beat all the time is that it's never too early. You should be talking to kids in kindergarten and primary school and getting them on board. You didn't focus particularly on gender in your talk, but we lose so many. I mean, half of our combined brains, are women, probably more actually. So how important do you see gender as part of this discussion, and how early does that conversation really need to start?
Man, we could have all night. I mean, gender is an incredibly important piece of this because we need a lot more diversity in the industry. And, we know, and all the data suggests that we get better business outcomes, we get better innovation outcomes if we create greater diversity. And there's all elements of diversity, but gender is certainly a critical one because, as you say, 50% of the population, it's hardly a minority. And I think we need to really challenge ourselves on a number of fronts here. I think as a society, we need to challenge ourselves on the stereotypes that we drive, and they still exist. And if we look at industries, if we look at the impact of those stereotypes, they don't only impact and hold back women, but they have a pretty devastating impact on young men as well. And that's the big thing for me in the construction industry and why I'm so passionate. We sit around the periphery of that, but I'm so passionate about that industry because it's not particularly welcoming to women or to minorities, but it also has the highest rate of male suicide of any of the industries in Australia. So it's clearly not particularly good for men either. So it needs to be shaken up. So I think we need to look critically as a society at our very deeply ingrained stereotypes and the impact that they have on all myriad of our society. I do agree with you. We need to get into schools early, and I think primary schools is the place to start. And I think we can only do that by having teachers that are even aware of what engineering and science and STEM is and the opportunity that it creates. I think with high school, we lose a lot of young women in high school. It's just the peer pressure again of those cultural expectations. We see a lot of kids turn away from STEM, but within that we see an inordinate amount of young women turn away from STEM. So there's a hell of a lot of work. It's a very complex arena to play in. But I do think that from a brand perspective, and I've had many conversations, particularly with Engineers Australia about this, and Romilly Madu's just stepped into the CEO role, and I know she's not an engineer, but she'll be quite passionate about this. How do we, and I do think it is making it less about the hard hats and high vis, and making it more about the broader opportunities that engineering brings. But my greatest fear, and I was even having this conversation today, is we talk about the minute increases in gender, in female participation in engineering, like in terms of the graduates coming out of graduate engineering schools. We talk about the minute gains that we're having percentage-wise. We're seeing the percentage of Australian engineering graduates, the women, really tick up very, very slowly. But the problem is the whole pie is reducing. So in number terms, we're actually not going anywhere. We might marginally be getting a little bit more of a pie, but it's a pie that is reducing, which is why, alongside being very passionate about getting more women into STEM, I am fundamentally passionate about just getting more kids into engineering.
Wonderful answer. Sally, yeah, you're just going to have to yell quite loud to get to the microphone, so please yell out.
I stole my question. I'm going to speak over the next few with Vanessa. I'm going to be very passionate about gender. So I thought it was lovely you talked about that. that diversity.
Mm.
And I think we are missing, and we need some really good role models that come, not from the base of engineering, but from ourselves.
Yeah.
Progress.
Yeah, well, Liz Broderick always said you can't be what you can't see, and I think that plays true in any gender-dominated profession, and again, it speaks to the fairly ingrained stereotypes that we have in Australia.
Let me go to Sally. Please speak up, Sally, for the
Yes.
microphone, and then question then. No question.
That's a very long lead time when we started
Yes.
primary school. So for right now, and talking to a friend of mine who's at CSL, who they're short at least 40 automation engineers at the
Yeah.
moment for their new factory. So we're getting to a point that we're not able to do things in Australia. What about actually looking at those people who haven't been trained as engineers but have been trained as scientists and could have top-up skills, or we could focus on other ways of bringing existing workforce upskilling into these industries, nurturing them through that process?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think it's a very interesting point, and I think the role is for bodies like Engineers Australia really to look at that and work with the universities to say, well, what sort of bridging skills, what professional skills exist where if somebody's done a 4-year course in X, what does the bridging look like to take that skill set to get the base skill sets required in engineering? I think one thing that is problematic is probably that we don't have, 30 years ago, if you were an engineering graduate, you typically went into a public works and you got a very decent technical grounding in that. And then when we sort of moved away from that, and as a consultant, we sort of chucked it into the hands of consultants where time's money. And I just think we've totally battered that to death. Probably for good reason, because we're businesses and we have different models, but that to me, if we still had that model, then that bridging program, you could see it working, because then you could take somebody at the end of that bridging program and still put them into a very safe space where they were going to get a very firm foundational expertise building program.
It becomes a bit more of a graduate apprenticeship.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. So I think it's a bit of a prickly thing to solve, but to your point, right? I mean, if we were 2023 is next year, 100,000 short, we have to get creative.
Time is going to get away from us. Got one more question from Robin here, very briefly, if you don't mind, Robin, and then Bronwyn will come up with a vote of thanks. Thanks.
Louise, thanks for that. Very tight, very good. So I'm going to keep it really brief. Thank you. Let me draw you on net zero, because you honed in on that as the big thing. If I look at the figures in Net Zero America, which has done the how do we get there and included the employment side, the figures are almost mind-blowing. If I just do a simple-minded energy in America, energy required, etc., and the decarbonising of it in Australia, I don't come up with a figure of tens of thousands of engineers. I come up with 1 million plus.
Right.
And this within 10 years.
Mm.
Now, we'll be in competition with the rest of the world, so we're not going to import them.
Yeah.
So putting you on the spot and drawing you out, how do we hit millions rather than tens of thousands? It's a serious question.
No, and I think your point about we are going to be in competition with the rest of the world, it's a very valid point. And you think about, when I talk to people in the industry about that, and I talk to clients will say, yeah, but we're doing this project and it's one of the biggest. And I'm like, yeah, but in Asia and in North America, they put our biggest a little bit to shame. So I think that competition with international is and the fact that our brand has been somewhat damaged over the last 2 years, rightly or wrongly. People are still a little bit hesitant to come to Australia and to New Zealand. To even if we were to get all the migrants in the world, we can't get as many as we've had in the past. This is why I think that we've got to look at the problem not as how do we get that many people in, but how do we somewhat, look at this from a different angle in terms of not only the productivity, but how do we use technology? How do we make some investments, and how do we collectively come together and get a little bit more collaboration, well, a lot more collaboration around the table. I can't come up with an answer of how I can give you 1 million engineers in 10 years. Yeah, it's certainly a frightening problem, and I think it will certainly constrain our ability to the fragmentation of where we are, and the fact that we're starting. I mean, we've only now got a government that even really wants to address this conversation. Yeah, look, it's hard not to get a little bit depressed when you think of it in that from that grand scheme of things. But I think we've got to give it a go, right? We've got to keep moving forward, and you know, I think if we pull all of those levers and we advocate for some sort of centralized platform that helps us easily pull all those levers, then, you know, we might we'll get as far as we can get.
Well, thank you, everyone. We've got to wrap up, but I'm going to ask Bronwyn to come up here and give a quick vote of thanks.
Before I do give the vote of thanks, I need you to all put a date in your diary, which is for our next monthly event, which is on July the 7th, and in a very awkward act of self-promotion, the speaker is me. Thank you for being my cheer squad. I appreciate it. Please turn up. Please come. But first of all, thank you, Michael, for your elegant and engaging work as MC as ever, and for curating this evening. Thank you, Louise. What an inspiring call to arms. It really was. You not only outlined the challenges, but you offered solutions. And we may not be able to stop engineers being too bloody useful, but we can inspire more engineers to come to our system. We can inspire more kids to become engineers. One of the things that ATSI is doing in this regard is ATSI has developed really engaging engineering learning kits through Stella. And if for all of anyone watching, actually, you don't need to be a fellow, you can donate a Stella kit to your local school. So that's something we could all do, as well as making sure that we're profiling the really exciting career options that are present in engineering. So you talked about something that I'm particularly passionate about, which is the increase in productivity available to us through automation and digitalisation, and how we can address the skills gap there. And you pointed out that action against climate change is everyone's business, and everyone in this room stands at your side, ready for action. Thank you, Louise.